The response that Melania Trump received when a talk show host attempted to make fun of her was so shocking that you can't even begin to comprehend what happened. The camera panned in a direction that revealed the 15th of October to be a clear and crisp morning over Manhattan, the kind of fall morning that makes the city feel alive with possibilities. Inside the dazzling tower that housed the ZN studios, senior producer David Cohen paced the length of his office phone, pressed to his ear. "She's genuinely coming. You are definitely sure about this?" He paused. "I am aware of the circumstances, but I am not going to run my hand over his graying hair. Ensure that security is completely impenetrable. We cannot allow any surprises to occur today in the lobby, where the head of security, Mike Torres, was present. Is informing his staff. Listen up, people. Our guest arrives in exactly 90 minutes. Want every entrance covered, every ID checked twice, and absolutely no unauthorized personnel past the second-floor checkpoint. What about the typical audience screening? And as Sarah Lopez, a junior security officer, triple verify everything, anyone showing. Even a trace of potential disruption gets kindly moved to another filming. The network can't afford any issues today. The morning show team bustled about with remarkable intensity. Makeup artists prepped their stations. Sound techs performed extra microphone checks, and the cleaning service took one more sweep of the already pristine green room in her dressing room. Sarah Mitchell stood before the mirror, adjusting her navy blazer with practiced precision. 20 years in broadcast journalism had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about today felt different. Her producer Rachel Yang knocked and entered without waiting for an answer. "Here is the current revision of the questions," Rachel said, handing them a big folder. Legal glanced over them. "Again, we had to amend the part about the 'I know what I am doing.'" "Rachel." Sarah interrupted, her gaze still fixed on her reflection. "I've interviewed 3 presidents, 2 prime ministers, and more celebrities than I can count. This isn't like those interviews, Sarah. The network wants ratings, and they'll get them." Sarah finally turned to face her producer. "How many journalists have gotten her to agree to a sit-down in the past 2 years?" "None." "You know why she selected our show?" Rachel shook her head. "Because we have a reputation for being severe, but fair. She respects that, even if she might not like it." "Now, what's the status of the audience properly verified?" "We've got a mix of demographics, just as asked. However, I should remark that 3 of the people in the front row are a disturbance in the corridor." Interrupted their conversation. Both women rushed out to examine. "What do you mean?" "The teleprompter is acting up. A technician was arguing with the floor manager. We checked it an hour ago." Sarah felt her gut clench. In all her years of broadcasting, technological issues before a big interview always made her anxious. She turned to Rachel. "Get it fixed." Now, meanwhile, across town, a beautiful black SUV managed the morning traffic in the back seat. Melania Trump read the morning's briefing papers, her face a study in calm focus. Her helper Maria Chen sat beside her, tablet in hand. The studio contacted again. Maria reported, "They want to know if you'll accept questions regarding the new book that just came out." Melania looked up from her papers. "That wasn't in the agreement." "No, it wasn't." Maria made a note on her tablet. "Should I remind them of the terms?" "No need." Melania returned to her documents. "They will try anyway." "They usually do." The car fell silent, save for the gentle shuffle of papers. Maria eyed her boss from the corner of her eye, marveling at her composure. She'd worked for Melania since 2018, through some of the most difficult stages of the Trump presidency and beyond. While the media sometimes depicted her as cold or disengaged, Maria knew a different side of her. "You know, they'll attempt to provoke you," Maria remarked quietly. "Sarah Mitchell has a reputation for getting under people's skin. Let her try." The trace of a smile flickered at the corners of Melon's mouth. "I didn't survive 4 years in the White House by being readily provoked." The SUV turned onto Broadway, joining the stream of yellow taxis and delivery vehicles in the front passenger seat. Head Of personal security. Jack Thompson whispered quietly into his radio, collaborating with the studio security crew bundle en route. He muttered, "Eat at 15 minutes. Confirm entrance protocol." Melania's phone buzzed. She peered at the computer, her expression softening slightly. "Baron sends his greetings. He has a math test today." H.E.K. Dowell. Maria assured her. "He always does." "Yes." Melania made a short response, but he worries too much about what people think like. His mother. Perhaps the car slowed as they reached the studio building already. A small gathering of photographers had gathered, their long lenses pointed on the secret entrance. Jack spoke again into his radio, his voice strained. "We've got paparazzi on the south gate. Request approval for alternate route." Melania continued examining her papers, evidently untouched by the noise outside. But Maria realized her grip on the folder tightened slightly inside the studio. The audience was beginning to file in. Sarah Mitchell's concert normally drew a mix of visitors and local professionals. But today's crowd seemed different, more polished, more cautious in their movements. Security guards checked and rechecked IDs, matching faces to approved lists. In the control room, David Cohen watched the displays with mounting, anxious. "Where are we on that teleprompter issue? Repaired." Brought out a technician. "It was just a loose connection." "Good. And the backup ready to go." "Sarah's earpiece testing now." David reclined back in his chair, trying to alleviate the tension in his shoulders. In 30 years of television production, he'd handled everything from breaking news to severe calamities. But something about today felt unprecedented. The SUV finally drew into the underground garage beneath the studio building as the security team took their positions. Maria handed Melania a small mirror. "Would you like to check your makeup before we walk up?" "No need." Melania grabbed her paperwork. Everything is precisely how it should be. The elevator ride to the studio floor was silent. Jack and 2 other security cops flanked Melania, while Maria checked her tablet one final time. As the doors opened, they were met by Mike Torres and his colleagues. "Mrs. Trump." Torres nodded respectfully. "If you'll follow me. We've acquired a secret way to the green room." The corridors were abnormally vacant, cleansed of the regular morning show bustle. As they moved, Melania could hear the distant murmur of the crowd being seated in the studio. Maria watched, her employer's face attentively, looking for any sign of uneasiness, but saw none. The green room was exquisite, but not extravagant, with comfy chairs and nice lighting. A makeup artist waited discreetly in the corner, but Melania shook her head slightly. The woman discreetly packed her stuff and left. "The show begins in 45 minutes. Maria announced. "Would you like to review the essential points again?" Number. Melania sat down. "Smooth her dress." "Tell me about Sarah Mitchell." "Not what's in the briefing. What do you know about her personally?" Maria startled, stunned by the question. "Well, she's been with the network for 15 years, started as a field reporter in Chicago. She's renowned for being harsh on both sides of the aisle, but especially hard on conservatives. She has 2 children, divorced 3 years ago. She's been pushing, wanting this interview for months. And what does she want from it? Ratings, clear lie. Maybe a viral moment. Some people believe she's being considered for the evening news anchor position." Melania nodded slowly, because she needs this to go properly. Before Maria could react, there was a knock at the door. Rachel Yang entered, her professional grin firmly in place. "Mrs. Trump, welcome to ZNN. I am Rachel, Sarah's producer. I just wanted to check if you need anything before we begin. Everything is good." "Thank you." Melania's response was kind, but great. "Wonderful. And just to confirm, we'll start with some questions about your present projects, then continue on to the agreed upon themes." "Yes." Maria stepped forward slightly. "We have the description." Rachel's smile didn't waver. "Of course, though. I should remark, given recent developments, Sarah might need to handle certain current occurrences. The agreement stands." Melania's voice was cool, yet had an unmistakable ring of authority. Shall we proceed with the interview as arranged or should we schedule for another time? The producer's smile faltered slightly. No, of course not. We'll stick to the deal. I'll come back in 30 minutes to take you to the studio after Rachel left. Maria looked to Melania. They're clearly preparing something. Of course they are. Melania stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city she'd called home for so many years. They always do. Yet today, we be different. Difference how Melania turned back to her helper. And for a moment, Maria glimpsed something in her eyes she hadn't seen before. Not determination. Exactly. But something closer to certainty. Since today, Melania remarked quietly, I have something to say in the studio. The audience was now fully seated. Sarah Mitchell stood off stage listening to the buzz of talk. She could pick out snippets here and there. Anticipation about what would be asked, whether there would be any dramatic moments. What Melania Trump was truly like in person. David Cohen's voice came through here. Our phones. 5 minutes to destinations. Sarah, are we clear on the strategy? Crystal clear, she said, fixing her blazer. One final time. Trust me, David. This isn't my first rodeo. No, but it might be our most essential one. The network president is watching this one personally. Sarah grinned to herself after 20 years of battling her way up through the ranks of broad journalism. She saw a chance when she saw one today, may change everything for her career. For the network, for the political environment. Itself back in the green room. Melania stood as Rachel returned the producers. Eyes widened slightly, at the sight of her somehow in the few times since she'd last seen her. Melania seemed to have grown even more composed. More regal. It's time. Mrs. Trump. Are you ready? Melania gathered her belongings, nodded to Maria as they proceeded toward the studio. The sounds of the audience grew louder, right before they reached the stage entrance. Melania paused. Maria. Yes, Ree. Remember what I said about today being different? Of course, watch attentively. Sometimes the most essential signals are in what isn't stated. With that, Melania Trump walked forward, ready to face whatever Sarah Mitchell and her audience had in store. The stage lights beckoned, and somewhere in the control room, a countdown began. The morning's main event was ready to begin. However, none of them, not Sarah Mitchell, not David Cohen, not even Maria Philly, anticipated just how different this interview would truly be. The studio lights blazed as Sarah Mitchell's characteristic opening song faded. The cameras moved around the audience. Before deciding on the host's familiar face. Good morning, America. Sarah began, her practice smile firmly in place. Today's guest needs no introduction, but tradition dictates one anyhow. Because she's been First Lady, a Model A businesswoman, and probably one of the most fascinating figures in contemporary American history. Please welcome Melania Trump. The applause was nice but restrained. When Melania went onto the scene, she moved, with practiced grace, acknowledging the audience with a modest nod before taking her seat across from Sarah. Mrs. Trump, hello to the show. Thank you for having me. Melania responded, her accent precise and managed. In the control room, David Cohen leaned forward. Easy does it. Sarah, start with the softballs. It's been 2 years since we've seen you in a formal interview setting. Sarah began. What made you chose this moment to break your silence? Melania shifted slightly in her chair. There is a time to talk and a time to observe. I feel this is the time for certain things to be spoken. And what things would those be? My work with children's charities continues. We have made considerable progress with the Be Fantastic initiative, especially in internet bullying avoidance. Sarah nodded, glancing at her papers. Yes, let's chat about B. Best. Some critics have argued. Perhaps we should examine the real findings. Melania inserted neatly. Past month alone, we helped implement anti-bullying programs in 50 schools across 5 states. In the green room, Maria studied the television closely, She knew Melania's subtle tactic, diverting without confrontation, maintaining control without appearing defensive. Sarah attempted a different approach. Your work with youngsters is commendable, but certainly you must be aware that many people are more interested in your views on recent political events. Are they concerned in truth or in creating headlines? Melania's query hung in the air for a second. In the control room, David said into Sarah's earpiece, "Push harder, but keep it professional." Speaking of truth, Sarah leaned forward significantly. Your recent absence from public gatherings has triggered tremendous conjecture. Some argue you are separating yourself from speculation is not reality. Melania cut in, her voice remained measured but carrying a new edge. What would you like to know? Particularly, Sarah shuffled her cards well. For instance, your decision to skip certain high-profile gatherings. You mean the private family activities that were projected as political pronouncements? A trace of emotion crept into Melania's voice. Tell me. Sarah, does your network always presume the worst about private family choices? The audience stirred. This wasn't the defensive response they'd expected. Mrs. Trump. Sarah tried again. Certainly. You comprehend public interest in your conduct, given your unique position. My position? Melania raised an eyebrow. And what role would that be? Previous First Lady. Immigrant mother-wife. Which label would you like to discuss first in the control room? David mumbled. Remain on course. Sarah, don't allow her. Control thestory. Sarah took a deep breath. Let's talk about your former chief of staff, Stephanie Grisham's book. She made some very startling accusations regarding. Let's talk what's genuine. Melania interrupted, her eyes flashing. You say a book created for profit. But did you investigate the children's hospitals? I visited without cameras. The family I still aid privately. The producer frantically signaled Sarah to go to commercial. Yet both women stayed entrenched in their verbal fight. Our viewers have a right to know. Your viewers have a right to truth, Melania replied. But truth takes context, doesn't it? In the crowd, a man in the third row murmured to his partner, this isn't going way. They intended. Sarah glanced over her notes again, visibly regrouping. You speak about truth and context. What about your silence during important occasions? People saw that translated. Melania's accent grew significantly stronger. Yes. Let's discuss about interpretations. When I donned a certain garment, your network spent hours interpreting when I adorned the White House for Christmas. There were moments when I opted to focus on my son's well-being. More perspectives. The tension in the studio was evident. Even the cameramen exchanged eyes. Mrs. Trump. Sarah tried. Again. Your job as First Lady. My role. Melania's voice had a touch of steel at me. Tell you about roles, Sarah. While your network was interpreting my silence, I was working while commentators dissected my expressions. I was interacting with families affected by the drug crisis as commentators ridiculed my accent. I was aiding youngsters in the green room. Maria smiled slightly. This was the Melania Scheck knew, controlled, but unyielding, courteous, but undeniably forceful. Sarah touched here, our phone listening to David's increasingly urgent directions. Perhaps we should take a little break. No, Melania said. Forcefully. Leighton, continue. You wanted to discuss quiet. There are various kinds of silence. Sarah. There's the silence of choosing one's battles wisely. There's the silence of safeguarding one's child from public scrutiny. And then there's the silence of media bias. When certain news are casually overlooked, the audience was utterly still, now hanging on every word. This wasn't the usual political dance they'd anticipated. Sarah struggled to retake control. You imply bias, but surely you understand that public people must expect inspection, scrutiny. Melania's smile was faint, but pointed. Is that what you term it? When your network published pieces criticizing my intelligence because of my accent? Is the scrutiny when photographers waited outside my son's school? When every action Every attitude was twisted to suit a preconceived narrative in the control room. David was nearly shouting into Sarah's earpiece, cut to commercial now. But Sarah Mitchell, veteran broadcaster and adept interviewer, finds herself in unfamiliar area. For possibly the first time in her career, she wasn't leading the debate. She was responding to it. Mrs. Trump, no one is questioning your intelligence. Aren't they? Melania's voice was silent yet carried to every area of the studio. So let's be clever together. Let's discuss the actual work, the fundamental issues, the ones that count. Beyond headline and book deals, the tension in the studio has altered. What begun as an attempt to explore and challenge had somehow morphed into something else. Totally. The audience, first divided in their sentiments, now sat in rapt attention. Sarah gazed at her producers, who were making increasingly agitated motions. But before she could change the discussion, Melania, continuing, "You know, Sarah, I've watched your show many times. You pride yourself on asking harsh questions, on seeking truth. Well, let me ask you something. With all your research for this interview, did you check into the actual results of the programs I've backed? Did you investigate the lives changed, the family, assisted the children, protected the issue, hung in the air, heavy with implication?" Sarah Mitchell, recognized for her fast reactions and fierce retorts, found herself momentarily dumbfounded in the green room. Maria said to herself, and there it is. The interview had reached a turning point. Though not the network had expected the carefully designed questions, the premeditated provocations, the hoped for gotcha minutes. Everything had somehow been turned back on themselves. Yet this was merely the beginning. As Sarah Mitchell gathered her plans for another effort, neither she nor her producers recognized that the real revelations were yet to come. The next segment would shake not just the studio audience, but the entire narrative that had been created around one of America's most misunderstood public celebrities. The studio air seemed electrified as Sarah Mitchell groped for her phone, her last resort step in what had been an increasingly tough interview. "Perhaps we should discuss some recent social media criticism." Sarah began her finger scanning through her computer. "Here is a tweet that went popular last week regarding, 'You're quiet during you want to chat about silence.'" Melania's voice held a new intensity that made even the camera operators pause. Her accent, usually carefully regulated, got more pronounced. "Let's talk about silence, Sarah." Actual silence in the control room. David Cohen grasped the edge of his console. "Stay with her, Sarah. Don't let this spiral." I stayed silent. Melania, continuing, leaning forward slightly, "When your network reported my son was autistic, a child." Sarah, "My child." The audience shifted uncomfortably. In the third row, a woman whispered to her neighbor, "I remember the story. It was horrific." I stayed mute. Melania went on here. "Yes, never leaving Sarah's. When protesters delivered letters with white powder to my family, did your network cover that subject with the same zeal they exhibited for scrutinizing my Christmas decorations?" Sarah peered at the producer, who was furiously gesturing from the sidelines. "Mrs. Trump, certainly you comprehend that public figures. Melania's interruption was subtle but decisive. "Let me tell you about being a public person. I stood mute when your co-workers criticized my accent when I was reading to children in hospitals. Silent when fashion magazines blacklisted me despite my background in the sector. Silent when every action, every expression was manipulated to fit a narrative in the green room." Maria watched the monitor with rising awe. She'd known Mia for years, had seen her strength in quiet moments. But this was different. This was years of controlled restraint, now finding its voice. Sarah attempted again, tapping her phone. "These tweets, hint to your tweets, or your TR truth." Melania's question pierced through the studio like a dagger. "Where were your cameras when I spent Christmas Eve with terminal youngsters at Walter Reed? Where were your fact checkers? When false tales were printed, the studio crowd had gone so silent, You could hear the air conditioning humming. Even the typically, our security personnel were watching closely. We have covered many of your charity's works. Sarah sought to argue. Her voice lacked its normal confidence. Having, you then perhaps you can tell me about the family in Ohio. Sarah blinked. I am sorry. What family in Ohio? The one I visited last month. The mother working 3 jobs, her daughter suffering leukemia. No cameras, no news releases, just help where it was required. Melania's voice softened slightly. But that doesn't make good television, does it? In the control room, David was furiously examining their research files. Sarah, we don't have anything concerning an Ohio visit shift the discussion. But Sarah Mitchell, veteran of innumerable high interviews, found herself increasingly off balance. The planned narratives were dissolving the cunning traps, springing. Empty your work with children is good, Sarah attempted, yet the public's interest extends beyond the public's interest. Melania grin held no warmth, or the media's goal. Did the people desire to know why I chose specific Christmas decorations? Or did your network spend weeks analyzing them while ignoring the charitable activities they represented from the audience? A murmur of agreement spread through the rows in the front row. An older woman nodded excitedly. Sarah grabbed her earpiece, listening to more urgent directions from the control room. Perhaps we should take a break. No, Melania said firmly. You needed honesty. Sarah, you wanted to comprehend the stillness. So let me tell you about the nights I spent soothing my son after he saw what your colleagues wrote about him. Let me tell you about the immigrant women that write to me, asking how I stay strong when my ACC accent gets mocked on national television. The studio grew warmer as the intensity built. A cosmetic artist moved to approach with powder, but was waved away by both women. Mrs. Trump, Sarah sought Torrigan control. Your experiences are undoubtedly valid, but valid. Melania accent got stronger with emotion. Is it the word we use? Now tell me, Sarah, when your network ran stories, doubting my intelligence because of my accent, was that valid journalism? When cameras stalked my son's school, was there valid public interest in the green room? Maria whispered to herself. They never saw this coming. Sarah glanced at her papers, but the meticulously prepared questions suddenly seemed insufficient, even dumb. The narrative they'd meant to build was being gradually demolished, replaced by something considerably more raw and compelling. Your passion for these problems is evident. Sarah tried, but surely you understand why people query, question. What exactly? Melania's voice remained measured, but held an undeniable intensity. My commitment, my knowledge, my independence. You talk of questions, Sarah. But let me ask you one. With all your research for this interview, did you discover a single tale about the scholarship program we developed for foster children? Did you explore the mentoring programs we've undertaken in underserved neighborhoods? The stillness that followed was deafening in the control room. David Cohen had halted, delivering orders through Sarah's earpiece, captivated by the developing scene. I wasn't aware of those programs. Sarah admitted, her professional mask slipping somewhat. Of course not. Melania's smile was sorrowful, yet knowing, because good work done quietly doesn't attract ratings, does it? The audience stirred, several members nodding in agreement. The tone in the studio had evolved considerably from the beginning of the interview. What had started as an attempt to provoke and expose has morphed into something altogether else, a moment of raw, uncensored truth. Sarah looked at her phone one last time and slowly put it down. Mrs. Trump, you've given us a lot to think about. No. Melania interrupted, gently. I've given you the truth. What you think about it, what you do with it, that's your option. Just like my silence was my decision. Not weakness, not submission, not lack of understanding. Choice in the control room. David Cohen had quit trying to manage the conversation. He sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't what we expected," he said to no one in particular. The studio light seemed to grow brighter as Melania continued her calm, impeccable. Despite the anguish in her words, "You welcomed me. Come to understand who I am. So, let me tell you, I am not a politician's wife who reads prepared statements. I am not a former model who married into privilege. I am a mother who saw her child's name trending on Twitter with harsh hashtags. I am an immigrant who loves America, despite its media's criticism, and I am a lady who chooses her battles." Carefully, the control room exploded in pandemonium as producers battled about whether to cut to commercial. But something blocked them from making the call. Perhaps the same. Something that kept the audience leaning forward in their chairs. They kept Sarah Mitchell abnormally silence that made even the most jaded camera operators pause in their motions. But before the director could answer, something unexpected happened. 3 audience members stood up, their applause breaking the tight stillness. Then a dozen more joined them. The spontaneous response swept through the studio like a wave. Sarah Mitchell sat frozen in her chair. Her usual snappy retorts and rapid comebacks absolutely absent. 20 years of broadcasting experience hadn't prepared her. "For this time, we need to wrap this up," she managed to remark, her voice almost steady. "Yes." Melania agreed, her calm intact, despite the anguish still visible in her voice. "But first, let me express anything to your audience, to all audiences in the green room." Maria leaned forward, watching the monitor attentively. This was the Melania she knew, the one the cameras rarely captured for years. Melania began, "I have observed while media networks like yours built storylines, some painted me as a victim, others as an accomplice, still others as someone too simple to understand what was happening around her." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. None of them bothered to see the truth. Sarah squirmed uneasily in her chair. "Mrs. Trump, I please." Melania held out her hand slightly. "Allow me to finish. This isn't about you, Sarah, or even your network. Particularly, this discusses something far larger." The audience remained standing, their attention entirely concentrated on the former First Lady. "You see," Melania continued, "while your cameras were seeking for controversy in my Christmas decorations, was helping with children who had never had a Christmas celebration. While your commentators were dissecting my facial expressions, I was holding the hands of mothers who had lost children to opioid. While your network questioned my brilliance due of my accent, I was using 5 languages to interact with immigrant youngsters who felt alone. And alone in the control room." David Cohen had ceased delivering commands. He stood captivated, watching the displays. "This is either going to make us or break us," he murmured. One of the producers whispered, "Should we cut the feed?" "It's too late," David answered. "It's already trending on social media." Indeed. Phones throughout the studio crowd were lighting up as excerpts from the interview began spreading online. The hashtag number Melania Speaks was already trending. Sarah Mitchell made one final attempt to regain control of her show. "Your perspective on these topics is undoubtedly convincing, yet compelling." Melania's small smile carried years of unspoken thoughts. "No, Sarah. The truth doesn't need to be compelling. It simply needs to be heard from the audience." Someone cried out, "We hear you." The studio security personnel exchanged uneasy glances, but the mood wasn't hostile. It was transforming. "Your producer attempted to tell you." Before Melania continued, addressing Sarah directly. Now she knew this interview wouldn't go as planned. But sometimes, Sarah, the most important tales are the ones we didn't plan to tell. Sarah's producer Rachel Yang stood off stage, her clipboard hanging loosely at her side. "This is going to change everything," she muttered to no one in particular. The studio lights seemed to grow warmer as Melania rose from her chair. "You invited me here looking for headlines. Instead, I hope I've given you something to think about judgment, about empathy, and regarding the cost of treating people as characters in a story rather than real beings." The applause got louder. Even some of the staff members had stopped their work to watch. Sarah Mitchell stayed seated, Her usual confident demeanor entirely vanished. Later media observers would point to this event as a turning point in her career. However, not in the way she had thought. We're getting calls from every major network. One of the producers announced in the control room. They all wanted to know whether we're going to broadcast the entire unedited footage. David Cohen ran his hands through his hair. Of course they do. This isn't just an interview anymore. It's a moment. Outside the studio, social media was exploding. Clips were being shared and reshared, commented on, examined, boot. Unlike the typical internet pandemonium, a curious agreement was building. People from across the political spectrum were shared the same opinion. They had never seen anything exactly like this. As Melania prepared to leave the studio, Maria approached with her coat. That wasn't what they expected. She remarked quietly, "No." Melania replied, a hint of delight in her voice. It was what they needed. The network executives were already assembling in emergency meetings. The show's scheduled afternoon repeat was suddenly a matter of considerable discussion. Some urged for editing, others that it needed to be broadcast in its entirety. Sarah Mitchell left the studio early that day, avoiding the normal post-show briefing. Her producer discovered her in her changing room, staring at her mirror. Sarah, Rachel began cautiously. "The network president wants to speak with you." "Of course he does." Sarah's laugh was hollow. "We just had the highest-rated morning segment in 3 years, and I appeared absolutely unprepared. No one could have prepared for that. Rachel provided that's just it." Sarah answered, gathering her stuff. "We should have. We had all the information. We just chose to focus on the incorrect story." Meanwhile, at a children's hospital fundraiser across, while the organizers were being inundated with calls, word had circulated that Melania Trump was scheduled to present at their next event, and suddenly everyone wanted to come. "We sold out," the event coordinator announced, looking stunned. "We've never sold out this far in advance." The impact of the interview continued to ripple outward. Media critics sought to analyze what had happened. Political commentator tried to fit it into their customary frameworks and realized they couldn't. This had been something different, something real. Later Thursday evening, as Melania sat in her study digesting the day's events, Maria delivered her a synopsis of the media coverage. "They're calling it a historic event in political conversations," Maria reported. "Ari." Melania didn't look up from her papers. "And what are they learning from it?" "That's the interesting part." Maria grinned. "They're not quite sure what to think. You didn't fit into any of their typical classifications." "Good," Melania answered, finally looking up. Perhaps now they'll stop attempting to categorize and start trying to comprehend. The next morning, Sarah Mitchell's show recorded its lowest ratings in 3 years. The viewers, it seemed, had seen something they couldn't unsee: the distinction between contrived drama and true truth. Yet perhaps the most notable difference wasn't in the ratings or the social media trends, or even the political analysis. It was in the quiet chats happening in homes and offices around the country, where individuals began to rethink their preconceptions, to look past headlines, to examine the personal cost of public judgment. As one media analyst would later write, in an age of perfectly prepared soundbites and political spectacle, Melania Trump didn't simply break the script. She showed why the script exists in the first place. And in doing so, she may have changed the way we think about public figures, about media narratives, and about the power of choosing when to stay mute and when to speak. The tale could have ended there, but its ripples continued to spread in the weeks that followed. Numerous prominent networks updated its guidelines for covering public figures. Social media platforms noticed a dramatic fall in harsh comments regarding accents and ethnic background, and perhaps most significantly, there was a subtle but significant shift in how the media viewed tales involving public persons, children. As for Sarah Mitchell, she would later regard that interview as both the lowest and highest point of her career. "I thought I was going to exposing someone's weakness," she wrote in her memoir. "Instead, I was shown the shortcoming in my own approach to journalism."